A few questions and answers for this week. So first question is based on the Hamdan versus Rumsfeld case. I was confused on the 5-3 majority opinion. Does the president have the right to suspend due process if it's harmful for national security? This is a perfectly reasonable question. The final vote was 5-3, but it turns out that there's the majority is the 4 liberal justices plus Kennedy, and Justice Kennedy doesn't join the full extent of the majority opinion. He does join this section. Which says that the military commissions, as they were designed, do not comply with constitutional law, and therefore his trial was illegal. The 4 liberal justices go on to suggest that the president doesn't really have much of a right to extend beyond the Constitution in this area, but Kennedy doesn't join this. Kennedy files a separate concurring opinion where he basically says, look, the job of the Supreme Court is to decide the case that is before us and not to expound on broader issues. So the result is that Hamdan is one of these, it's a somewhat limited case that casts doubt on the Bush approach, but doesn't necessarily create a limit on what the president can or cannot do with regards to national security issues. So it's also a case I suspect that may very well not come out the same way if it were to come to the court today. Conservative justices tend to be more deferential on national security questions, and both Kennedy and Ginsburg were replaced by more conservative figures. Second question, what's the lasting legacy of the Shivo case in regard to national politics or other court cases? Mentioned the pressure the Bush administration felt from conservative Catholics and evangelical Christians, but I was wondering how this, along with the public backlash, played out in the case's aftermath. This too is a good question. I think there were 2 areas where this was significant. One, a policy issue, and one, a more general issue politically. On the policy issue, I do think that the Shivo case played some role in the subsequent battle. I mean, so Shivo is 2005, 2006, but it plays some role in the subsequent battle over same-sex marriage. Because one of the core arguments of opponents of the same-sex marriage in the political realm was that allowing gays and lesbians to marry would threaten traditional marriages and the rights that come from traditional marriages, of which one is this the right of spouses to make medical decisions and other legal decisions in cases like Shivo's, where the spouse is incapable of making a decision, him or herself, and the overlap between those who argue that same-sex marriage is a harm to traditional marriage and those who were saying that we need legislation to override the Shivo marriage and allow the grandparents to make the decisions was sort of one-to-one. So it does expose opponents of same-sex marriage to charges of hypocrisy. That's a fairly narrow policy impact, but I think it was one. The broader policy impact is that I think this contributes to by associating religion in the public realm with conservative views, like everything else in American society today seems to become polarized. And the result is, we see that this is a chart. This just came out a few months ago from Gallup, which shows that for the first time in American history since they polled, a majority of Americans say that they are not a member of a church, a synagogue, or a mosque. And you can see, Shivo again is 2005, 2006. You can see the decline kind of begins fairly closely after that. So, Shivo is not the only issue here. I mean, same-sex marriage is another, abortion is a third, where organized religion is associated with with a particular ideological view. But I do think that some of the decline in affiliation with organized religion, is that Shivo plays some role here. This, by the way, this is a huge development in contemporary American politics, and I don't think we've fully come to grips with how significant this could be if we do move towards a society that's basically half religious, half non-religious, and the religious component mostly votes for Republicans, and the non-religious component mostly votes for Democrats. So, I don't think that that this decline is likely to reverse itself. Like if we were to all come back here 20 years from now, I doubt very much we would see this number getting back up to 70 or 75. So there has been a price paid in terms of association with organized religion for the involvement of sort of these conservative religious groups in politics as a whole. Third question is do voter IDs laws have precedence, and why is voter ID law successful at keeping Democrats away from polls more than Republicans? Do voter IDs laws have a clear precedent? I think the answer here is largely no. I mean, for most of American history, with the exception of the utter extremes, which are Jim Crow laws, there were minimal restrictions on voting. When of course there was very significant fraud as well, in Texas and in New York City with Tammany Hall, and Chicago with the Democratic machines in Chicago, and suburban Chicago with the Republican machines. The trade-off, I think, for most of American history was a willingness to tolerate a certain level of fraud, but to provide very minimal restrictions on voting. And so, probably there's not much in terms of a precedent. So why is the voter ID law successful at keeping Democrats away from the polls more than Republicans? And here there are a couple of factors to keep in mind. The first is, at the end of the day, we are talking about, and I mean the rhetoric on both sides of this issue is so hyperbolic. It's worth, you can sort of try to look past it a little bit. We're talking about a relatively small number of people, but for voter ID, the groups tend to be younger, urban, and minority, who are groups disproportionately Democratic. And so if if you have an election with 5 million voters and 1,000 are disenfranchised as a result of a voter ID law, that skew might be 70-30 Democratic. And if it's a really, really tight race, that might be the difference in the race. Now, of course, there are very few really, really tight statewide races, but there have been a handful of them. Obviously, Bush versus Gore is one. Another was this race in Minnesota, a Senate race in 2008 that was decided by a couple hundred votes. So they had to recount ballots like this, where the person had cast votes for the candidates on the ballot, but had written in lizard people to all in all of the approach. And so this ballot actually was thrown out on grounds that it was a double vote. The person for Senate voted for the Democratic candidate Al Franken, but also wrote in lizard people. And so I think both parties are so obsessed with this idea that we've got to come up with every single way to maximize our advantage in terms of election law, because we don't know, it might be a really, really close election like Florida in 2000, or like the Senate race in Minnesota in 2008. So in the Minnesota race, the Republican candidate Norm Coleman was actually winning after all the votes had been counted. And then in the recount and subsequent legal challenge, Franken passes him. And I think the result was a correct result, but it was a race where it was a very small number of votes that decided. And then your last question: who do I believe handled the social issues better during their terms, Bush or Obama? To some extent, the question here is, how do you judge, this issue of better? There's this very famous exit poll. This is an exit poll from the 2004 presidential election, which showed that the single most important issue for voters in the 2004 election was moral values, more important than the economy, more important than terrorism or healthcare, taxes, or the war in Iraq, which is it's a shocking number. And there's subsequent elections, it hasn't been anywhere near that high. But the Bush people had really emphasized social issues, abortion, same-sex marriage. And of those people who said that moral values was the most important issue, 80% of them voted for Bush. So this is very much in debate among political scientists, commentators, historians. But you can make an argument that Bush's massaging of the social issues debate helped him, at the very least, in 2004, which was a pretty close election. Similarly, though, you can argue that Obama was able to use social issues very effectively to be reelected in 2012. He focused on a variety of issues: immigration, the executive order allowing Dreamers to stay in the country, contraception, the requirements that companies carry contraception, cover contraception under the Health Care Act, same-sex marriage, where Obama rediscovered his support for same-sex marriage in the run-up to the 2012 election. And these issues collectively appealed to suburban voters who were, and these are voters that have moved very, very heavily to Democrats in 2016, 2020 because of Trump, appealed to suburban voters who kind of liked Romney, the Republican candidate, on the economy, but ultimately sided with Obama. So, in terms of who handled it best, I think you could argue that they're about even, and that even though they were on very different sides of the social issue, that both Bush and Obama were able to effectively exploit social issues to their advantage in their reelection bids, '04 for Bush and 2012 for Obama. So that's it for our Q&A for this week. Hope everyone is safe and is staying well.